They said, "It's just for immediate family, you'll see the photos later." The words landed like a stone against my chest. Not sharp, not loud, not even cruel on the surface, but heavy, sinking, dragging me down where I stood in the living room with the phone still pressed against my ear. My niece's voice was light, almost apologetic, the way one softens the blow of a decision already made. She was explaining the arrangements for her wedding, the plans already finalized. "A small ceremony," she said. "Just immediate family." But I wasn't to worry. They'd make sure plenty of photos were taken. I could see it all afterward. Afterward. It was such a peculiar word to offer someone who had ironed her school uniforms when her own mother was too tired, who had stayed up late making soup when she caught the flu, who had sewn lace into her birthday dress when she was 11 because she wanted to feel like a princess. Afterward. The word itself felt like a locked door shutting in my face. I didn't argue. I couldn't. The kind of silence that follows such a pronouncement is heavier than any reply. My throat tightened until even the thought of protest seemed impossible. So I made some non-committal sound, a little awe that probably passed for understanding, though inside I felt as though my insides had been rearranged. When the call ended, I set the phone on the table with careful precision, as though it were a fragile object. The living room around me was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet where the refrigerator's hum feels intrusive, and the ticking of the clock suddenly grows louder, each second punctuating the weight of being uninvited. I sat there for a long time, staring at the table, until finally I rose and walked to the window. The street outside was ordinary, untroubled. Neighbors' cars lined the curb. A boy down the block chased a basketball that clattered across the pavement. The ordinary world moved forward as if nothing had shifted. Yet for me, something had. It wasn't about a wedding, not entirely. It was about what it meant. To be told that immediate family existed as a circle that somehow did not include me. To be reminded, bluntly, that bloodlines and bonds are not always the same thing. I thought back, unbidden, to the dozens of moments that had convinced me otherwise. How my niece used to run into my arms after school, chattering about playground squabbles. How she once insisted I sit next to her at the school play, gripping my hand so tightly through her nervousness that my knuckles ached. How she cried on my shoulder the night her first boyfriend broke her heart, whispering, "You're the only one who understands." But now, apparently, I was not immediate family. The kettle whistled faintly in the kitchen. I must have filled it out of habit earlier. I went and poured the water over a tea bag, my hands moving mechanically. The steam rose, and I watched it curl upward, fragile and temporary. That's how I felt, suspended, weightless, ready to dissolve. I carried the cup to the armchair and sat down. The tea was too hot, but I sipped anyway, welcoming the sting on my tongue. It gave me something tangible, something immediate, when everything else felt like it had slipped through my fingers. I tried to reason with myself. Weddings are complicated, I thought. Budgets, seating charts, logistics. Maybe it wasn't meant as rejection. Maybe it was simply circumstance. But the words echoed again, immediate family. The way she said it, gentle but firm, left little room for doubt. A memory surfaced, one I hadn't visited in years. When my sister, her mother, first announced her pregnancy, she had come to me in tears, overwhelmed. We were sitting on my back porch, the summer air thick and warm. She had clutched my hand and said, "I don't know if I can do this." And I had promised her, without hesitation, "You won't do it alone. I'll be here." And I was. Every late-night phone call, every emergency babysitting, every holiday meal where I brought the extra dish so she wouldn't have to. To be written out of the circle now, after all that, was more than oversight. It was erasure. The clock struck the hour. The sound startled me. I set down the tea, now cooling in my hands, and stood again. I began moving through the rooms of my home, tidying small things without thought. Straightening a cushion. Folding a blanket. Wiping down the counter. Each task gave me a sense of control, however slight. But beneath it all, the ache remained, constant as the tide. I didn't tell anyone that day. I didn't call a friend to complain, or write an email to my sister to demand an explanation. I kept it folded inside me like a sharp piece of glass wrapped in cloth. I thought perhaps if I tucked it away long enough, it might dull. But glass doesn't dull. It waits. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed long after the lamp was switched off. The house felt cavernous, every creak and sigh of the walls reminding me how empty it was. I should have been sleeping. Instead, I found myself whispering aloud to the darkness, immediate family. As though saying the words again might somehow make them less absurd. Less cruel. It didn't. The following week was filled with ordinary rhythms. Work, groceries, laundry. On the surface, nothing had changed. But every time I opened the refrigerator, I saw the bottle of wine I'd bought months ago, intending to bring it as a gift to the wedding. Every time I folded my clothes, I saw the dress hanging in the closet, the one I had been saving for the occasion. Small, ordinary reminders, now made sharp by absence. I began noticing other things too. The way friends spoke of their families with such unthinking inclusion. "We're all meeting up," they'd say. "We're all celebrating." That word, all. It had once applied to me too, or so I thought. Now it seemed to stop at a line I hadn't realized existed. One evening, unable to sit still, I took a walk. The air was brisk, and the trees along the street had begun to lose their leaves. I watched one leaf spiral down, land on the pavement, and skitter along until it vanished into the gutter. That's how I felt, carried off by forces I hadn't chosen, discarded without notice. I tried to convince myself I wouldn't go. That I would respect their decision, stay home, and accept my role as spectator to the photographs they promised to share. But something inside me resisted. Some small, stubborn spark whispered that presence wasn't theirs to permit or deny. That I had earned the right to witness this day, not through blood alone, but through years of love, effort, and sacrifice. And yet, the doubt lingered. Would my arrival be seen as intrusion? Would I be resented, whispered about, cast in the role of troublemaker? The thought of that chilled me. But the thought of staying home, of letting myself be erased quietly, chilled me more. So, one morning, I found myself standing before the mirror, holding the dress against my body. The same dress I had bought months ago, imagining this very day. It still fit. It still looked like something a woman could wear proudly. My hands trembled slightly as I smoothed the fabric down. I told no one of my plan. Not a friend, not a neighbor, not even myself in clear words. I simply prepared. I ironed the dress, polished my shoes, and placed them carefully by the door. I folded a shawl over my armchair, in case the venue was drafty. Each step felt like reclaiming a piece of something that had been taken. The morning of the ceremony, I woke before dawn. The sky was still dark, streaked faintly with silver where the first light threatened to break through. I brewed tea, but couldn't drink it. My stomach churned too much. Instead, I stood at the window again, watching the quiet street, until finally I turned and dressed. The dress slid over me easily. The shoes pinched a little, but I welcomed the discomfort. It grounded me. I clasped the shawl over my shoulders and took a deep breath. The mirror reflected a woman who looked older than she felt inside, hair streaked with gray, lines etched at the corners of her eyes. But there was something else too. Something steadier, quieter. A determination I hadn't seen in myself for a long time. I locked the door behind me and stepped out into the cool morning. The air carried the scent of damp earth and distant blossoms. My heart pounded, but my steps were steady. I was going. Whether they wanted me there or not, I was going. And as I walked toward the ceremony that had tried to exclude me, I realized something: this wasn't about them anymore. It was about me. About refusing to let love and years of devotion be erased by a convenient definition of family. So I kept walking. Each step carried me closer, not just to the venue, but to a version of myself I thought I had lost. The venue came into view long before I reached its doors. A converted hall, white stone walls softened with ivy, the kind of place chosen for its photographable charm. Cars lined the lot and spilled onto the nearby street, polished to a shine as if even the vehicles wanted to look their best for the occasion. I slowed my steps, not because I doubted, but because I needed to catch my breath. It felt as though the air itself pressed down on me, heavy with everything unsaid. At the entrance, a pair of young ushers stood in neat suits. Their smiles faltered when they saw me. Not cruelly, just the hesitation of people uncertain where someone belongs. One of them opened his mouth as though to ask, but I simply inclined my head and walked past, shawl gathered tightly around me. I offered no explanation. Explanations, I'd decided, were part of the exclusion. To justify my presence would be to concede that it required justification. Inside, the air was warm, humming with voices. The smell of roses and lilies wafted through, mingling with the faint tang of polished wood. Guests milled about, chatting in low tones, smoothing skirts, adjusting ties. I felt eyes on me as I walked, the quick glances, the subtle double takes. I kept my chin lifted, gaze forward. My pulse pounded so loudly in my ears it nearly drowned out the murmur of conversation. I found a seat near the middle, not too close to the front where the family clustered, not hidden in the back either. Neutral ground. The cushion dipped beneath me, and I smoothed my dress again, my fingers trembling slightly. Around me, people shifted and whispered, but no one spoke directly to me. That suited me fine. Then, across the aisle, I saw my sister. She wore pale lavender, her hair styled more elaborately than I'd ever seen. She looked radiant, though her eyes flickered with nerves. When her gaze swept across the room and landed on me, her smile faltered. For a moment, time seemed to stop. I saw the calculation in her face, surprise first, then confusion, then something else I couldn't quite name. But she didn't nod, didn't wave, didn't acknowledge me beyond that flicker. She simply turned back to the woman beside her, resuming the conversation. The space between us stretched wider than the aisle. I sat there, still, while the music began to play. The notes unfurled slowly, delicate as lace. Guests hushed. Heads turned toward the entrance. My niece appeared, glowing in white, her arm linked with her father's. The collective intake of breath was almost audible. She looked beautiful, of course she did. But beneath the veil, her expression was steady, determined. She had always been that way, her own compass, unwavering. As she walked down the aisle, my throat tightened. Memories swelled, her first steps across my living room floor, her awkward teenage stride, her triumphant march across the stage at graduation. I had been there for all of it. And now I was here for this, whether or not they wanted me. She passed by me without a glance. That hurt more than I expected. I had braced for whispers, for raised eyebrows, for someone to approach me and say, "You shouldn't be here." I hadn't braced for invisibility. The ceremony unfolded in a blur of vows and soft laughter. The couple's voices trembled as they spoke promises, eyes locked on each other. Guests dabbed at tears. Hands squeezed in silent approval. I watched, absorbing it all, though it felt as though I hovered just outside a window, looking in. When the officiant declared them married and applause filled the hall, I clapped too. My palms stung with the force of it. For a fleeting moment, I let myself imagine that I belonged, that my hands joined with everyone else's in celebration, not in defiance. Afterward, chairs scraped back, and the crowd spilled toward the reception room. I rose slowly, adjusting my shawl. I considered leaving then, slipping out before the weight of glances and silence grew unbearable. But something rooted me in place. Perhaps it was the years of devotion that had gone unnoticed. Perhaps it was simply stubbornness. Either way, my feet carried me forward. The reception was lavish. Tables draped in linen, glasses catching the light, platters of food artfully arranged. Laughter bubbled around me. I moved quietly to the edge of the room, uncertain where to stand. A waiter offered champagne, and I accepted, grateful for something to hold. The bubbles fizzed sharply against my tongue, a reminder that I was still here, still present. I watched my niece and her new husband greet guests. She smiled easily, leaned in for hugs, posed for photos. When she reached the table near me, her gaze brushed over me again. For a moment, our eyes met. I thought, hoped, she might cross the space between us, might say something, anything. Instead, she turned, drawn into another embrace, her laughter ringing out like bells. The ache deepened. Not anger, not yet. Just ache. I drifted toward the wall, where photographs of the couple were displayed on easels. Childhood snapshots, candid moments, carefully staged portraits. People gathered around, pointing and reminiscing. I recognized so many of those moments, birthdays I had attended, trips I had helped organize, milestones I had witnessed. Yet here they were, presented as a timeline that seemed to erase my presence. One photo in particular caught me. My niece at age 6, missing front teeth, holding a balloon in one hand. I had taken that photo. I remembered crouching in the grass, coaxing her to smile. And yet, beneath the frame, the credit line read only, Family Collection. Family. I set the glass down, the stem trembling in my fingers. Around me, conversations swirled. Toasts were made, clinking of glasses echoing. I stood apart, listening but not partaking. With each passing minute, I felt the distance growing, stretching, threatening to consume me. I thought of leaving again. I could slip out now, unnoticed. Perhaps that would be the dignified thing to do. But then I caught sight of an older woman across the room, a guest, perhaps from the groom's side. She too stood slightly apart, her eyes following the crowd with a mixture of affection and weariness. For an instant, our gazes met. She gave me the smallest nod, as though to say, I see you. It was nothing, and it was everything. I stayed. Hours passed. Plates were cleared, music played. Couples danced, children darted between tables, laughter rang out. I remained near the edge, not entirely invisible but not included either. It was a strange limbo, present but peripheral. As evening deepened, the newlyweds prepared to leave. Guests gathered at the exit, showering them with petals. I moved with the crowd, swept along. My niece and her husband appeared, radiant, waving as cameras flashed. She glanced my way one final time. Our eyes locked. For the briefest second, her smile faltered, something flickering behind her eyes, surprise, guilt, perhaps recognition. And then she was gone, swept into the waiting car, petals clinging to her veil. The crowd cheered. The car drove off. And just like that, it was over. Guests lingered, exchanging hugs, promises to keep in touch. I slipped away quietly, my shawl tight around my shoulders. Outside, the night air was cool, scented with roses crushed beneath departing footsteps. I walked slowly toward the street, each step heavy. I had done it. I had walked into the ceremony they tried to keep me from. I had seen it with my own eyes. But as I stood beneath the street lamp, the ache settled deeper. Because being present wasn't the same as being included. Still, something inside me shifted. I hadn't vanished into silence. I hadn't accepted erasure without a fight. Even if no one had spoken to me, even if no recognition came, I had been there. I had witnessed. I had claimed my space. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was the beginning of something I had yet to understand. The morning after the wedding, my house felt unnaturally still. The dress hung over the back of the chair where I had draped it late the night before, shawl folded neatly on top. My shoes sat side by side on the rug, faint scuffs at the tips betraying how long I'd stood on my feet. I had thought exhaustion would carry me into sleep, but it hadn't. I had lain awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying each look, each silence, each unspoken word. Now the sunlight crept across the floor, pale and indifferent. I rose slowly, body heavy, and made my way to the kitchen. The kettle's whistle seemed louder than usual, shriller. When I poured the tea, the water struck the bag with a hiss, releasing a bitter scent. I carried the cup to the table and sat, hands wrapped around the ceramic. The taste was metallic, as though grief itself had seeped into the tea. I set it down after a sip. My hands fidgeted, restless. Without thinking, I opened the drawer where I kept envelopes and stationery. The sight of blank paper made me pause. I thought of writing a letter, perhaps to my sister, perhaps to my niece. But the words refused to take shape. So instead, I closed the drawer, leaving the silence intact. My phone buzzed on the counter. I glanced at the screen. A message from my sister. "You shouldn't have come yesterday. It was supposed to be simple. Now people are asking questions." I read it twice, 3 times. My hand tightened around the phone. Not a word about how I looked. Not a word about how I must have felt, sitting there among strangers. Only the inconvenience I caused. I set the phone down, face down, unwilling to read it again. The minutes stretched. Then, almost against my own will, I picked it up and typed back, "I was there for her childhood. I've been there all along. That makes me family, whether you write me into it or not." My thumb hovered. For a moment, I considered deleting it, swallowing my words the way I always had. But something inside me rebelled. I pressed send. The screen glowed, message delivered. The reply came quickly. "This wasn't about you. Stop making everything about you." My chest tightened. I put the phone down, turned it over again so the screen faced the table. I didn't reply. Not then. Instead, I rose and began moving through the house, restless energy propelling me. I stripped the sheets from the bed and put them in the wash. I wiped the counters, though they were already clean. I opened the windows wide, letting in the sharp bite of autumn air. Each movement steadied me, though the ache beneath remained. Later, I pulled out a box from the closet, an old one, filled with photographs and keepsakes. I spread them on the living room floor. There she was, my niece, at every age. Chubby cheeks smeared with birthday cake. Toothless grin clutching her first bicycle. High school portrait, eyes lined too dark, smile hesitant. I ran my fingers over each photo, remembering the exact moments. None of those images would ever appear in their family collection. But they were mine. Proof that I had been present. Proof that my love had mattered, even if unacknowledged. As I sat surrounded by memories, a knock sounded at the door. I hesitated, then rose. When I opened it, my neighbor Mrs. Patel stood there, holding a small container. "I made extra soup," she said simply, placing it in my hands. "Thought you might like some." Her eyes lingered on me a moment, reading more than I had spoken aloud. I managed a small smile, thanked her, and carried the container to the kitchen. When I opened it, steam rose, fragrant with cumin and ginger. I poured some into a bowl and ate slowly. Each spoonful warmed me from the inside, reminding me that kindness sometimes arrived from unexpected corners. That evening, as the sun slipped low, I stepped outside. The air carried a faint chill, leaves rustling along the sidewalk. I walked without destination, passing familiar houses, the park where children's laughter echoed faintly, the small florist with its display of chrysanthemums. I paused before the window, gazing at the blooms. Their brightness pressed against the glass, vivid against the fading light. On impulse, I stepped inside. The shop was quiet, the air rich with damp earth and petals. I chose a single scarf from the stand near the counter, soft wool, dyed in deep burgundy. Not flowers, but fabric. Something for me. The shopkeeper wrapped it carefully, and I carried it home, the package small but significant in my hand. That night, I draped the scarf over a chair. A simple thing, yet it felt like a promise to myself. Not erasure, not silence, but something of my own choosing. The days that followed were strange. Social media bloomed with photographs of the wedding, smiling faces, clinking glasses, the couple beaming. I scrolled through them, noting the angles, the curated joy. I was not in any of them. Not once. It was as if I had never stepped into that hall at all. But I knew I had. My shawl had brushed those chairs. My hands had clapped with theirs. My eyes had witnessed vows spoken. I had existed, even if their lenses refused to capture it. Then one evening, a new message appeared. Not from my sister this time, but from my niece. I saw you. Thank you for coming. 6 words. No more. But I stared at them for a long time, heart aching with something I couldn't name. Gratitude, sorrow, relief, perhaps all entwined. I typed no reply. I simply let the words rest, glowing softly on the screen. In the quiet afterward, I poured another cup of tea. The steam rose once more, curling upward, fragile but insistent. I held the cup steady, watching as it warmed my palms. Something was shifting. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, but shifting nonetheless. The message from my niece lingered in my mind for days. I saw you. Thank you for coming. 6 words, almost weightless, yet they carried a strange gravity. They didn't erase the ache of being sidelined, nor did they mend the rift with my sister, but they settled somewhere deep, a quiet acknowledgement I hadn't realized I was desperate for. Still, I didn't reply. Partly because I didn't know what to say, partly because I feared saying too much. Words had always been my trap, the more I explained, the less I was heard. So I let silence be my answer, not in bitterness, but in preservation. The scarf I'd bought at the florist's remained draped over my chair. I began wearing it each morning, wrapping it loosely as I brewed my tea. It was warm against my neck, a small ritual of care. A reminder that even in the aftermath of exclusion, I could choose something for myself. Work filled my weekdays, as it always had. The motions were familiar: emails, phone calls, papers stacked and filed. Yet I noticed a subtle shift in myself. Where before I might have nodded along in meetings, content to let others steer, I found myself speaking up more. Small points, simple clarifications, but each time I did, a ripple of surprise passed across my colleagues' faces. As though they had grown used to my silence, just as my family had. One afternoon, after a particularly long day, I stopped at a cafe near the office. I ordered a slice of cake along with my tea, something indulgent, something I hadn't allowed myself in years. As I sat by the window, fork in hand, I thought about the wedding again. The hush when I entered the hall, the looks, the invisibility that followed. For so long, I had shaped myself to avoid causing discomfort. I had kept to the edges, believing that if I stayed small enough, quiet enough, I would be allowed to belong. And yet, when it mattered most, they had drawn the circle without me anyway. So what, I wondered, was the use of smallness? The cake was sweet, the icing cloying. I ate it anyway, each bite a quiet rebellion. That weekend, I decided to clean out my closets. It was partly practical, the shelves sagged with clothes I hadn't worn in years, but it was also more than that. I wanted to see what I had been keeping, what I had been holding onto without noticing. Piece by piece, I pulled items out. Dresses from weddings and baptisms, scarves from long-forgotten trips, coats I had kept just in case. Each item carried a ghost of a memory, most tied to family gatherings, to moments where I had shown up, filled the gaps, done what was expected. I folded some to give away, set others aside to discard. It was slow work, but strangely freeing. At the bottom of one box, I found a notebook. The cover was faded, the pages yellowed, but as I opened it, my own handwriting spilled across the lines. Journal entries from years ago, hurried notes about frustrations, quiet confessions I'd never spoken aloud. One passage caught my breath: I keep giving, and still they find ways to remind me I don't quite count. I don't know how to stop without losing myself. I sat on the floor, notebook open, scarf pulled around my shoulders. It felt as though the woman who wrote those words was still here, still waiting. I closed the book gently, not with despair, but with recognition. The phone rang that afternoon. It was my sister. I stared at the screen before answering. Her voice was brisk, as though nothing had happened. I wanted to let you know, we're having a small family dinner next week. Just us. I thought you might come. The irony stung, just us, after excluding me from the very definition of family weeks earlier. But I said, I'll think about it. A pause stretched between us, taut. Then she said, look, about the wedding, it wasn't personal. We had to keep it small. I swallowed. My instinct was to nod, to soothe, to let her words cover the wound. But the memory of the notebook, of my own voice written years ago, steadied me. It felt personal, I said quietly. Silence. I could almost hear her drawing in a breath, readying her defenses. But I didn't add more. For once, I let the truth sit bare, without apology. Well, she said finally, her tone clipped, I suppose what's done is done. Let me know about the dinner. When the call ended, I sat there, phone in hand, heart racing. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't made a scene. But I had said something I would once have swallowed. That, in itself, was a shift. All week, I thought about the dinner. Part of me wanted to go, to prove I could still step into their circle, even if reluctantly offered. Another part of me balked at the idea of sliding back into the same old patterns, sitting quietly, nodding along, pretending I wasn't still bruised. The evening arrived, and I chose not to go. Instead, I cooked myself a simple meal, lit a candle on the table, and ate slowly, savoring the quiet. For once, my absence wasn't a wound. It was a choice. In the days that followed, I began reaching out to people I had long neglected. Old friends, neighbors, colleagues I had once shared lunches with but drifted away from. I invited them for tea, for walks, for simple afternoons. One friend brought a bundle of flowers from her garden, another showed me photos of her grandchildren. Each visit reminded me that family could be chosen too, woven from threads of care and attention rather than blood alone. And slowly, the weight in my chest began to lift. Not gone, not yet, but lighter. One Sunday, I walked to the park. The trees were shedding the last of their leaves, gold and crimson carpeting the ground. Children ran, their laughter ringing, while couples strolled hand in hand. I sat on a bench, scarf wrapped tight, and let the sun warm my face. For the first time in weeks, I felt still. Not erased. Not invisible. Just myself. I thought again of my niece's message. I saw you. Thank you for coming. Perhaps, in time, there would be more. Perhaps not. Either way, I realized I couldn't keep waiting for recognition like rain in a drought. I had to learn to water my own roots. As the afternoon light faded, I rose from the bench and walked home. My steps were unhurried, steady. Each one felt like a small claim on my own life, my own space. That night, as I draped the burgundy scarf over the chair, I whispered aloud, I am here. Not for their circle. Not for their approval. But for myself. The dinner I skipped became its own quiet scandal. A cousin texted afterward, we missed you. Your sister said you weren't feeling up to it. I read the words twice, a bitter laugh escaping. That was how it had always been, my choices rewritten into excuses, my absence softened so no one questioned the truth. But this time, I didn't correct it. I didn't rush to explain myself. I let the silence stand. Because for once, my story was mine to hold, not theirs to polish. Days later, I ran into my sister at the market. She was choosing apples, inspecting each one with the same critical eye she used on everything in life. When she saw me, her face tightened. You could have come, she said flatly. I didn't want to, I answered. The words came calmly, without edge, but her eyes widened as though I had struck her. Her mouth opened, then closed. Finally she shook her head. "You've changed." "Maybe I have," I said. I picked up a bag of oranges, holding them like an anchor. "Or maybe I'm just tired of being the one left out." She inhaled sharply, but I didn't wait for her reply. I turned and walked toward the checkout. My heart was pounding, but my steps were steady. For once, I hadn't bent myself into apology. That night, I replayed the moment in my mind. Not with regret, but with a quiet satisfaction. She could call it change if she wanted. To me, it felt more like return to a voice I'd buried years ago. The next morning, I received another message from my niece. Longer this time. "I know it was hard, being there that day. I saw your face when I walked down the aisle. I wanted to come to you, but everything felt complicated. I'm sorry if it hurt. It meant more than I can say, seeing you there." I read it slowly, tears stinging my eyes. For weeks, I had carried the weight of invisibility, of being excluded and dismissed. And now, at last, a crack of honesty. Acknowledgement. Not enough to undo the pain, but enough to soften it. I typed back carefully, "It did hurt. But I came because I love you. That hasn't changed, and it won't." Her reply came minutes later. "I love you too." I set the phone down, hands trembling. The ache was still there, yes, but it was threaded now with something gentler. Not quite healing, but the beginning of it. That evening, I pulled the burgundy scarf around my shoulders and stepped outside. The air was cool, the sky streaked with the last light of sunset. As I walked down the street, I felt the fabric warm against my skin, solid and real. I had been erased from their photographs, excluded from their definitions. But I had walked into that hall anyway. I had stayed. I had claimed my space. And now, step by step, I was learning to claim my life too. Winter settled in slowly, with bare branches scratching the sky on evenings that came too soon. I found myself walking more often, wrapped in my burgundy scarf, the cold air burning my cheeks. There was something grounding in the rhythm of my steps, the crunch of frost underfoot, the hush of a world pulled inward. The holidays loomed ahead, heavy with their familiar rituals. In years past, I would have spent them with my sister's family, hovering at the edges of gatherings, filling in gaps where needed, washing dishes, entertaining children, slipping into whatever role was expected. This year, I hesitated. Then came her message, "We're hosting Christmas dinner. Will you come?" No explanations this time. No conditions. Just the invitation. I stared at it for a long moment. I thought of the wedding, of the dinner I had declined, of the confrontation in the market. I thought of my niece's message, her quiet admission. And I thought of myself, the woman I was slowly rediscovering. I typed back, "Yes, I'll come." When the day arrived, I dressed simply. No fuss, no attempt to dazzle. I wrapped the scarf around my shoulders and carried a dish of roasted vegetables, not the elaborate spread I used to prepare, just one contribution, no more, no less. The house was alive with noise when I arrived. Laughter spilled from the kitchen, music played faintly in the background. For a moment, standing on the porch, I almost turned back. But then I lifted my hand and knocked. My niece opened the door. She looked tired but radiant, her cheeks flushed with warmth. When she saw me, her eyes softened. "You came," she said. "I did," I replied. She stepped aside, letting me in. The house smelled of cinnamon and cloves, of roasting meat, of celebration. Coats hung in the hallway, shoes scattered on the mat. I set my dish down in the kitchen and moved slowly into the living room. Conversations faltered for a moment as I entered, then resumed. Some faces glanced at me with mild surprise, others with polite smiles. My sister approached, her expression unreadable. "Thank you for coming," she said. Her words were formal, almost stiff, but they were words she had never spoken before. I inclined my head. "Thank you for asking." She nodded, and for once, she didn't rush to fill the silence. She moved away to tend to the table, leaving me standing there, holding my place in the room. As the evening unfolded, I sat among them, not at the center, not at the edges either. Just present. I laughed at a nephew's clumsy joke, passed plates, listened to stories. My sister's eyes flicked toward me now and then, wary, measuring, but she said nothing more. That was fine. Not every wound required words. At one point, my niece leaned over and whispered, "I'm glad you're here." And I believed her. Later, as the meal wound down, I slipped outside for air. The yard was quiet, snow glittering under the porch light. I stood there, breathing in the cold, watching my breath curl into the night. Footsteps approached behind me. My sister. She joined me without speaking, folding her arms against the chill. For a long while, we stood side by side, the silence taut but not unbearable. Finally, she said, "I didn't realize how much I leaned on you." I suppose I thought it was understood. The words weren't apology, not fully, but they were closer than I had expected. I turned to her. It was understood. But it wasn't respected. Her shoulders stiffened, then eased. She nodded once, slowly. "Maybe you're right. We didn't embrace. We didn't smooth it over with easy affection. But something in the air shifted, not healed, not mended, but acknowledged. And sometimes, that is the first step." I left later that night with a small container of leftovers, my scarf pulled tight, my heart both heavy and light. Heavy with all that had been lost, light with the sense that perhaps not everything was beyond repair. Back home, I set the container in the fridge and lit a single candle on the table. The house was quiet again, but not the same kind of quiet as before. This quiet felt chosen, claimed. I thought of the wedding, of walking into that hall despite their words. I thought of the ache that followed, the messages, the confrontations, the shifts. And I thought of this night, not a grand reconciliation, but a quiet recognition that I had carved out space for myself, space they could no longer deny. I poured tea and sat by the window. Outside, snow drifted slowly, softening the edges of the world. My reflection in the glass looked older, yes, but steadier too. For so long, I had measured my worth by their circles, their definitions. Now, I understood something deeper. Belonging doesn't come from waiting for others to name you. It comes from naming yourself. I lifted the cup to my lips, the steam warming my face. "I am here," I whispered again, this time not as a plea, but as a truth.